The year was 1625, and the air in London was thick with tension. Daniel Featley, a prominent Puritan minister, was about to lose his power. The rising tide of anti-Calvinism and the growing influence of the Caroline regime were squeezing him out. But Featley was not one to go down without a fight. On November 8th and 9, 1625, he made a bold move. He licensed two of his own works, a private prayer book called Exila Pietatis, and a collection of sermons titled Select Texts of Holy Scriptures opened in 6 sermons. These works were more than just books. They were his final stand against the encroaching darkness. Clavis Mystica, a massive collection of 70 sermons, was published a decade later in 1636. It was a towering achievement, a 900-page tome that Featley dedicated to King Charles I. But this wasn't just about advancing his career. It was a strategic move to ensure his voice would be heard even as the Laudian regime tightened its grip on the English church. For Featley, the printed word was a powerful tool. He believed that while spoken words could reach only a few, written words could reach many. For that which is spoken cometh but to a few that are within hearing, and stayeth not by them. But that which is written, and much more that which is printed, presenteth itself to the view of all, and is always ready at hand, he wrote. This was more than just a philosophical statement. It was a call to action. The sermons in Clavis Mystica were delivered in various settings throughout Featley's career. There were sermons from Sergeant's Inn in Fleet Street, Paul's Cross, and even from his time at Oxford. Each sermon was a deep dive into the Scriptures, a dive that Featley likened to a diver fetching precious pearls from the bottom of the sea. The diversity of these settings highlighted the breadth of Featley's influence and the significance of his preaching. In his dedicatory epistle, Featley claimed that he decided to publish his collection because of the desires of some friends and the need to combat proper heresies of these times. These sermons were the presentist remedies against those venomous serpents which infest the Church of Christ, whether heretics or schismatic. Featley portrayed himself as a champion of the English Church, a defender of the faith against the encroachment of heresy. This was a strategic move to direct attention away from the work's covert attacks on Laudianism. The years 1635 to 1637 were pivotal. England was facing a series of political and ecclesiastical challenges. Anglo-Spanish negotiations were faltering, and the threat of war loomed. The 1636 plague was seen as God's judgment, and the 1637 trial of Prynne, Burton, and Bastwick demonstrated the Laudian regime's intolerance for sedition. Featley's timing was crucial. He waited for the optimal moment to release his collection, knowing that it would have a significant impact on the English Church. The Laudian regime responded by formulating and disseminating official policy. 1635 and 1636 saw a surge in printed treatises by Laudian ministers, including visitation sermons by John Pocklington, Peter Heylin, and John Featley. These sermons focused on defending the government's policies and extolling the beauty of holiness. John Featley, Daniel's nephew, was part of this effort, even while serving as a curate at his church in Lambeth. Featley and other non-Laudian divines were not passive. They published their own sermon collections to provide an alternative to the Laudian policies. These collections presented rival theological positions that stood in stark contrast to the Laudian ideals. Featley's Clavis Mystica was a powerful counter-narrative, emphasizing the importance of a robust preaching ministry, critiquing the beauty of holiness movement, and displaying a more antagonistic approach to Catholicism. For Featley, preaching and prayer were central to a minister's calling. He believed that a magistrate had the right to overrule one's private conscience on things indifferent if that person rejected the forms of the English Church as enshrined in the Book of Common Prayer. Angela Pietatis was a devotional work that Featley intended to penetrate the hearts of his readers like a sermon. It was a fluid blend of devotion and doctrine, designed to heat cold hearts and enlighten offended understandings. Throughout the 1630s, Featley navigated a tricky landscape. He endeavored to provide for the perceived pastoral needs of his readers, while positioning himself to avoid reprimand from an increasingly hostile Laudian regime. His strategic utilization of these tactical maneuvers allowed him to survive and thrive in a polarized ecclesiastical terrain. As the 1630s wore on, the battle for the pulpit intensified. Featley's Clavis Mystica and Angela Pietatis were not just books, they were weapons in a war of ideas. Each page was a testament to his commitment to the Reformed faith and his determination to stand against the rising tide of anti-Calvinism. The battle for the soul of the English Church was far from over, and Featley was ready to fight. Daniel Featley's Clavis Mystica was a massive book that showed how important he thought preaching was for the church. Featley believed that a strong preaching ministry was essential for leading and nurturing God's people. This view was very different from what the Laudians, led by Archbishop William Laud, thought about preaching. The Laudians believed that reading the Bible in church was enough and that detailed preaching was not necessary. They thought that public prayer was more important than preaching, and that the main job of a minister was to lead the liturgy and administer the sacraments, rather than to preach. This was a big shift from the traditional view that preaching was central to the church's life. Featley strongly disagreed with this. He believed that ministers should be feeding the flock by preaching painfully and powerfully. He argued that preaching should not just be about making people feel good, but about challenging them and helping them grow in their faith. He was concerned that some ministers were more interested in being comfortable and respected than in being effective shepherds. In The Faithful Shepherd, Featley emphasized that ministers should be diligent in their preaching, not just reading the Bible. He used difficult Bible passages to show that preaching was necessary to help people understand and apply the Scriptures. He believed that a good preacher could prick the heart of the listener, not just tickle their ears. Featley also knew that his words could be seen as a challenge to those in power. He was careful about how he expressed his views, using what historians call coats of pulpit discourse. This meant that he could signal disagreement without saying it directly. For example, he might criticize a practice that was similar to what the Laudians were doing, but frame it as a critique of Catholicism. This way, he could avoid direct confrontation, but still make his point. One of the main issues Featley addressed was the Laudian beauty of holiness movement. This movement focused on making churches beautiful with decorations, candles, and images. Featley saw this as a distraction from the true beauty of the church, which he believed should come from the spiritual lives of the people. He argued that spending money on decorations was less important than helping people grow in their faith. However, when Featley tried to publish his sermons, he faced censorship. William Bray, who was in charge of reviewing sermons, made significant changes to Featley's work. Bray softened Featley's criticisms of church decorations and images, changing the focus from the decorations themselves to the lack of spiritual depth. For example, Bray changed Featley's statement that the true adorning of the church, it is not with the beauty of pictures, but with holiness, to the chief adorning of the church. It is not with the beauty of colors, but with holiness. This change made Featley's critique less direct and less critical of the Laudian practices. Despite the censorship, Featley managed to publish an uncensored version of his sermons using an old license. This showed that he was not just a passive victim of the Laudian regime, but an active opponent. He used his knowledge of the licensing system to challenge the authorities and provide an alternative to their ideas. John Prideaux, one of Featley's colleagues, also faced similar challenges. Prideaux's sermons, collected in Certain Sermons, were also targeted by the Laudians for their critiques of the beauty of holiness movement. Prideaux, like Featley, believed that the excesses of ceremonial piety were causing divisions in the church. He argued that the focus on external beauty was leading to a lack of spiritual depth. The Laudians, including Archbishop Laud, were very aware of the critiques from Featley and Prideaux. They tried to control the spread of these ideas by censoring sermons and scolding those who spoke out. For example, Prideaux was scolded by Laud and almost lost his position at Oxford because of his resistance to changes in the church. Despite the tensions, both Featley and Prideaux still defended many of the traditional practices of the English church, such as the church calendar and festivals. They were not against all ceremonies, but they were against the idea that ceremonies could replace the importance of preaching and spiritual growth. The clash between Featley, Prideaux, and the Laudians shows how deeply divided the church was in the 1630s. It was a time of intense debate and conflict, with both sides trying to shape the future of the English church. Featley and Prideaux used their sermons and writings to defend what they believed was the true purpose of the church: to feed the flock through powerful and meaningful preaching. Daniel Featley, the rector of Lambeth, was not just a preacher, but a man deeply committed to the upkeep and improvement of his church. The Lambeth churchwarden's accounts from 1615 show that even before Featley took over, the parishioners were already contributing to the church's repair and beautification. Featley continued this effort, and by the mid-1630s, the church was a focus of community support. In 1637, George Scottson, one of the churchwardens, spent over £33 on repairing the church and its fence. This was a significant amount, showing the parish's dedication to maintaining their place of worship. Featley's commitment to the church extended beyond just the physical structure. His wife, Joyce, left a lasting legacy when she willed a beautiful communion cup to the church. This cup was made from the sale of her most precious jewels, ensuring that the ornaments that once adorned her would now adorn the Church of God. After her death in 1639, Featley honored her wish, and the chalice and paten, with inscriptions noting the donation, are still preserved at the parish of North Lambeth. This focus on church maintenance wasn't unique to Featley. Julia Merritt has shown that many ministers, not just those aligned with Archbishop Laud, valued the importance of keeping churches in good condition. This shared priority highlights that, despite the conflicts between different religious groups, there were common goals, such as maintaining the physical and spiritual integrity of the church. Featley believed that a minister's role was multifaceted. He saw a pastor as a prophet through preaching, a priest through administering the sacraments, and a king by exercising authority as an ordained officer of the church. This holistic view meant that he opposed any attempts to diminish the importance of these roles. For Featley, each aspect was crucial to the ministry. One of Featley's most significant contributions was his strong stance against Catholicism. His sermons, compiled in a large folio book, were known for their thorough criticism of Roman Catholic practices. Featley's opposition to Catholicism was not just about religious differences. It was also a subtle critique of the Laudians, who he believed were too lenient in their dealings with Catholics. For example, Featley reported that Archbishop Laud had approved the licensing of a book by a Catholic priest, Sancta Clara, despite opposition from other Reformed bishops. This incident highlighted the tensions between Featley and the Laudians, who were seen as accommodating to Catholic influences. Despite the efforts of Laudian authorities to censor anti-Catholic content, Featley's works remained saturated with such criticism. William Bray, a Laudian licensor, did attempt to remove some of these passages, but the sheer volume of Featley's work made it difficult to sanitize completely. This suggests that Featley's influence persisted even under strict censorship. The release of Featley's sermon collection, Clavis Mystica, in 1638, was a strategic move. It came at a time when the significance of preaching was being challenged by the Laudians. By publishing a large collection of sermons, Featley was not only providing a resource for his congregation, but also countering the Laudian emphasis on liturgical uniformity. The collection was printed in a large, expensive format, indicating that it was meant to be used in public settings, such as for less experienced ministers or for additional sermons at public gatherings. Featley's pastoral sensitivity is evident in his earlier work, Ancilla Pietatis, published in 1626. This devotional book was designed to help readers pray and understand the Scriptures. It was structured like a medieval primer, with daily devotions for both morning and evening, and special devotions for feast and fast days. Each devotion included a scriptural excerpt, a hymn, and a prayer. Featley used the Beatitudes to guide readers in developing their spiritual character, providing scriptural examples and encouragement. Ancilla Pietatis was Featley's most popular work, reaching 9 editions by 1675. It was respected by both conformist and nonconformist Protestants, and even influenced the creation of Charles I's devotional work, Eken Basiliek. The book was also translated into French and Dutch, earning Featley international acclaim. His devotional work was seen as a valuable resource for private and family devotion, helping readers to navigate their spiritual lives during times of great suffering. Featley's work in both public and private piety shows his deep commitment to the church and his community. Whether through his sermons or his devotional writings, Featley sought to provide guidance and comfort, ensuring that the means of grace were available to all who sought them. Daniel Featley, a minister in the 17th century, was deeply concerned about the spiritual well-being of his congregation, especially during times of crisis. One of the most significant crises he faced was the plague outbreak of 1625 to 1626, which claimed thousands of lives and forced many people to stay at home unable to attend church services. To help his parishioners, Featley wrote a catechism called The Sum of Saving Knowledge, which was designed to be a guide for families to follow on the Sabbath. The catechism was divided into 52 sections, one for each week of the year. Featley believed that the Sabbath was the most important day of the week, and he encouraged families to gather and discuss their spiritual progress. The head of the household would lead the discussion, helping everyone understand the basics of true religion and how to live a godly life. Featley also believed that celebrating the Sabbath was more important than any other festival, and he warned against celebrating other holidays in a way that might be considered profane. When Featley reviewed his friend Thomas Vickers's catechism, he suggested that it be divided into 52 sections just like his own, to make it easier for families to follow. Featley was not just a minister, but also a literary agent, helping other writers improve their work. He was motivated by both pastoral and practical reasons, wanting to provide his congregation with the spiritual tools they needed, especially during difficult times. During the plague, Featley saw a need for a guide that could help people maintain their faith and devotion when they couldn't attend church. He wrote Ancilla Pietatis, The Handmaid of Piety, as a small, portable book that people could carry with them. This book included prayers, scriptures, and guidance for private devotions, which were especially important during the plague when public worship was difficult. Featley had personal experience with the plague. He once thought he had contracted it and wrote Exilla Pietatis for his own comfort. Later he realized he had only been sick with a non-infectious disease. He had also written pastoral letters and a devotional treatise during a previous plague outbreak in 1609, when he lost friends and helped others who were suffering. Featley believed that private devotions were essential, especially during times of great loss and fear. He encouraged people to pray and read the Bible, using the book as a source of comfort and guidance. Featley's approach to private devotion was influenced by the medieval primer, a type of book that contained prayers and other religious content. He wanted to help his readers avoid the dangers of excessive self-examination, which could lead to doubt and anxiety. Instead, he emphasized the importance of living a life of repentance and perseverance, which he believed were more reliable signs of one's faith. Featley's work was also a response to the theological debates of his time. He sought to create a middle ground between those who emphasized prescribed prayers and those who favored more spontaneous forms of worship. He defended the use of set prayers and the observance of feast and fast days, arguing that these practices were consistent with the traditions of the early church and other Reformed churches. He believed that the established church had the authority to set these practices, and that individuals should conform to them even if they had personal scruples. During the plague, Featley's book provided a structured way for people to maintain their faith and connection to God. It was a practical guide that helped them navigate the challenges of isolation and fear. Featley's work reflects his deep commitment to both the pastoral care of his congregation and the traditions of the church, showing how he used his own experiences and knowledge to support and guide others. During the 1620s and 1630s, Daniel Featley, a prominent English clergyman, found himself in a tricky position. He needed to defend the established Church of England, while also avoiding trouble with the powerful Laudian regime. The Laudians, led by Archbishop William Laud, were pushing for a more ceremonial and traditional approach to worship, which often clashed with the more Reformed and Calvinist views of many other clergy. Featley wrote a book called Exilla Pietatis, Pulpit of Piety, in 1626, which he dedicated to the Duchess of Buckingham, a former patron who had shifted her support to the anti-Calvinists. This book was Featley's way of showing his loyalty to the established church while also trying to stay on the good side of the Laudians. However, he was also careful not to completely align himself with their more controversial practices. Around the same time, another clergyman named John Cosin published The Hours of Prayer, 1627. Cosin's book was very popular and went through 10 editions before 1710. Both Featley and Cosin were defending the use of set prayers, the church calendar, and obedience to church authorities on matters that were considered indifferent, neither essential nor forbidden by Scripture. Despite their similar goals, Featley and Cosin seemed to be in competition, and Featley never directly responded to Cosin's work. This might have been because Featley wanted to avoid conflict with Cosin's supporters, including Richard Montague and Richard Neile, who had previously censured Featley. In 1626, King Charles I issued a proclamation to maintain peace in the Church of England, which may have influenced Featley's decision to stay silent. However, Featley's Reformed colleagues, Henry Burton and William Prynne, were not so cautious. They wrote polemical treatises against Montague and accused Cosin's work of being secretly Catholic. As a result, Burton and Prynne were brought before the High Commissioners and punished. Featley, on the other hand, took a more subtle approach. He included a dedication to the Countess of Denbigh in the second part of Ancilla Pietatis, hoping to win her favor. The Countess was considering converting to Catholicism, and Featley gave her his anti-Catholic writings to discourage her. He also included a section in his book about the gunpowder plot, comparing the Catholic conspirators to the villains in the Book of Esther, to highlight the dangers of Catholicism. Despite his efforts to avoid conflict, Featley's work contained some points that went against the Laudian vision. He believed that private devotion was just as important as public worship, and that the liturgical calendar should not be overemphasized. He argued that no day was inherently more holy than another, and that too much focus on feast and fast days could lead to superstition. Featley's views on private and public piety were nuanced. While he encouraged a vibrant private devotional life, he also stressed the importance of attending public worship, especially when one's time was limited. However, Featley's indirect criticism eventually caught up with him. In the second edition of Ancilla Pietatis, he made a comment about St. George, suggesting that he was a fictional figure. This comment was seen as an attack on the medieval traditions that the Laudians valued, and Featley was forced to apologize to Dr. William Laud. He later added a note to clarify that he was referring to a different George, an Arian heretic, but the damage was done. Despite his opposition to some Laudian practices, Featley continued to cooperate with the regime. He acted as a mediator between the Court of High Commission and troublesome Puritans, encouraging them to submit to Laudian regulations. The Court of High Commission was known for its harsh treatment of those who defied its rules, and Featley's role as a mediator was a delicate one. He had to balance his own beliefs with the need to maintain good relations with the authorities. One example of Featley's mediating role was his interaction with Roger Quatermain, a Puritan lawyer who was summoned to the Court of High Commission for holding a conventicle, a private religious meeting. Quatermain argued that these meetings were not schismatic, but were meant to complement public worship. Featley, while acting as a mediator, likely tried to help Quatermain understand the importance of conforming to the Church's rules, even if he personally disagreed with some of them. Throughout this period, Featley's careful balancing act reflects the complex religious and political landscape of 17th century England. He was a man of deep faith who sought to navigate the turbulent waters of ecclesiastical politics while staying true to his principles. Quatermain faced a tough situation when he was asked to take the oath ex officio in 1640. This oath was a powerful tool used by the authorities to make people answer questions truthfully, and it was backed by the threat of divine judgment. Quatermain, being a Puritan, refused to take the oath because he believed it went against his religious beliefs. Instead of forcing him, the authorities sent him to speak with a man named Featley, hoping he could convince Quatermain to change his mind. Featley tried hard to persuade Quatermain that the oath was lawful, even sharing his own experience of taking the oath to avoid danger. He also used Bible verses to support his argument, but Quatermain remained unconvinced. Quatermain pointed out that the oath had been used in the past by rulers like Henry IV and Mary I to persecute people who didn't agree with them. He saw the oath as a tool for oppression. Despite Quatermain's refusal, Featley promised to report back to the court in a way that wouldn't harm Quatermain. In his report, Featley described Quatermain as someone who followed the Church's teachings, except for his issue with the oath. Featley believed that if given more time, Quatermain might change his mind. This report actually helped Quatermain avoid being sent to prison. Later, Featley met with Quatermain and other Puritans, and he found them willing to conform to the Church's practices, except for the oath. Featley's role as a mediator helped protect these Puritans from harsh punishment. This was significant because it showed that even though the church leaders, known as Laudians, were known for being strict, they were sometimes willing to be more lenient and work with Puritans. Around this time, Featley was also preaching at court, which was a sign that the king was open to hearing from Puritans. This was a time when the relationship between the church and the Puritans was becoming more complex. Some church leaders were starting to soften their stance and try to work with the Puritans to maintain stability. However, Featley's efforts to balance between the church and the Puritans eventually caught up with him. In 1643, some of his parishioners accused him of introducing new practices to his church, like standing during certain prayers and bowing at the name of Jesus. Featley denied these charges and argued that these practices were not new and were actually part of the church's traditions. He also pointed out that the Puritans were the ones who were being too strict and were the real innovators. When Featley appeared before a committee to answer these charges, he defended himself by explaining that the practices he followed were not new and were part of the church's history. He also argued that he opposed the more extreme changes that the church leaders, the Laudians, were trying to introduce. Despite the accusations, the committee ultimately found Featley not guilty, partly because of his past service to the church and his role in the Westminster Assembly. Featley's trial and his testimony against the Archbishop Laud during the same period show how complex the political and religious landscape was in the early 1640s. People like Featley had to navigate between different groups and sometimes side with those they partly disagreed with to achieve a greater good. This period was marked by shifting allegiances and a struggle to find a balance between tradition and reform. Daniel Featley, a minister in the early 1600s, was deeply committed to both preaching and prayer. He believed that these two practices were essential for a vibrant Christian life and should not be seen as separate or competing. Featley's works on prayer and preaching show that he saw them as complementary, not rivals. He published these works at strategic times to demonstrate that a strong Christian life needed both robust preaching and fervent prayer. Historians have often categorized early Stuart ministers into two groups: those who focused on preaching and those who focused on prayer and sacraments. However, Featley's approach challenges this simple division. He emphasized the importance of both preaching and prayer, showing that these practices were intertwined and mutually reinforcing. For Featley, a healthy church required both the public preaching of the Word and a strong private prayer life. Featley's publications were not just devotional. They also had a political and ecclesiastical context. He used his writings to position himself within the mainstream of the English Church and to defend against nonconformist views. This was a time of tension and change in the Church, and Featley's works were part of a broader effort to maintain the established forms of worship and doctrine. He was careful to align himself with the Church's traditions while also addressing the challenges of his time. One of Featley's key works, Clavis Mystica, was a collection of sermons that he published in 1635. This collection was not just a collection of religious teachings, it was also a strategic move to counter the policies of Archbishop William Laud, who was promoting a different vision of orthodoxy. Featley's sermons emphasized the importance of preaching and warned against the dangers of over-adorning churches and the influence of Catholicism. By focusing on difficult and mysterious texts of Scripture, Featley indirectly underscored the need for skilled preachers to interpret and explain these texts. Featley's role as a licensor of publications also allowed him to influence the content of religious works. He used this position to keep Puritans within the English Church and to promote a balanced approach to worship and doctrine. His devotional works, like Ancilla Pietatis, were not just about personal piety, but also contained subtle polemics against those who threatened the established forms of the Church. For Featley, devotion and confrontation were closely linked. He believed that defending God's truth and fostering a deep personal faith were two sides of the same coin. He saw his polemical writings as a way to protect the Church from false teachings and to preserve the most valuable devotional practices. Featley's approach was to attack faulty forms of worship and to promote a balanced and traditional approach to Christian life. In the 1630s, Featley and his fellow Calvinist conformists were not passive victims of Laudian oppression. Instead, they waited for the right moment to publish their works and to present an alternative vision of pastoral theology. They saw themselves as defenders of the established forms of the Church and as protectors of the true faith. Featley's works on prayer and preaching were part of this broader effort to maintain the integrity of the Church and to provide a robust alternative to the policies of the time. Featley's approach to ministry and theology was shaped by the political and ecclesiastical environment of the late 1620s and 1630s. His writings reflected deep commitment to the established forms of the English Church, as enshrined in the Book of Common Prayer, and a zealous defense against those who threatened these forms. By combining devotion and confrontation, Featley aimed to protect and strengthen the Church during a time of significant change and challenge. As we wrap up our journey through the world of religious texts and practices in early modern England, we've explored a rich tapestry of devotion, controversy, and the everyday lives of people who lived through tumultuous times. From the heated debates over Catholicism to the personal prayers of the devout, we've seen how religious beliefs shaped the way people thought, felt, and lived. Daniel Featley, a prominent figure in this era, wrote extensively on religious matters. His book, Ancilla Pietatis, went through multiple editions, showing its enduring appeal and the importance of private devotion in people's lives. Featley's work was not just a collection of prayers, but a guide for navigating the spiritual challenges of the time. He addressed various aspects of life, from the joys of marriage to the trials of illness and death, offering comfort and guidance to his readers. The period was marked by significant religious and political tensions. The Gunpowder Plot, for example, left a lasting impact on the national consciousness, and its memory was preserved in the Book of Common Prayer. This shows how religious texts were not just spiritual guides, but also tools for shaping national identity and memory. We've also seen how the printing press played a crucial role in spreading religious ideas. Books like Ancilla Pietatis and Clavis Mystica reached a wide audience, helping to shape the way people practiced their faith. The rise of printed materials made it easier for individuals to engage with religious texts and form their own interpretations, which sometimes led to conflicts with the established Church. The practice of private devotion was a central theme in this era. People like Featley and John Cosin provided prayers and meditations that could be used in the home, reflecting the importance of personal spirituality. These texts were often tailored to specific needs, such as the prayers for women in childbirth, which showed a deep concern for the well-being of the entire community. The relationship between public and private devotion was complex. While the Church sought to maintain order and uniformity, many individuals found ways to express their faith in more personal and diverse ways. This tension between conformity and individuality is a recurring theme in the history of religion in early modern England. The impact of these texts and practices extended beyond the religious sphere. They influenced political debates, social norms, and even the way people responded to crises like the plague. For example, during the 1625 plague, Featley wrote pastoral letters to his parishioners, offering spiritual support and practical advice. This shows how religious leaders played a crucial role in community life, providing both spiritual and practical guidance. In the end, the religious texts and practices of early modern England reflect a society in transition. They show the deep faith of the people, the challenges they faced, and the ways they sought to find meaning and purpose in a rapidly changing world. As we look back on this period, we can see how these texts and practices continue to offer insights into the human experience, reminding us of the enduring power of faith and the importance of community in times of need.